Okay, it's precisely 1 o'clock, so we'll make a perfectly punctual start to this discussion meeting about the second Obama administration term, as it were. We've had the election, we've had the inauguration, and the question is, now what? And it's a question that we expressed on the front cover of the last issue of Survival in terms of forward, question mark. And it's a question that the President himself seems still to be debating with himself, I guess, in some ways. If you saw the inauguration ceremony itself, you would have noticed perhaps that at the end of it, having given his speech and making his way back into the Congress building, he was captured by the cameras turning around for one last look, and he was seen to be saying to himself and overheard to be saying to himself that this would be the last time that he would get this view. It's a melancholy thought perhaps for some, it's for him perhaps melancholy, but also liberating in terms of what it might imply for the ambitions that he chooses to set for himself. So the question is, if forward, in what direction and at what pace? So we will try to address that question today with two of my colleagues, Dana Allen, Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy and Transatlantic Affairs, and also editor, of course, of Survival, and Mark Fitzpatrick, who is Director of our Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program, and both of them have, in the very recent past, as well as more generally, contributed to Survival on key and core elements on the U.S. foreign policy debate. Dana is going to kick off by addressing in about 15 minutes or so the domestic political significance of the Obama re-election and try to relate that to what it means about the interaction between domestic politics and the foreign policy agenda. Mark will then go into much more detail concerning some of the core foreign policy challenges with which the Obama administration is going to have to wrestle, the priorities that it might establish for itself, and he'll do that perhaps with particular emphasis on questions of nuclear or non-proliferation policy, where he has an enormous corpus of work that's appeared in Survival, but also more generally to draw your attention to. And of course, he may make reference to the fact that in addition to the fact that we have the president re-elected, we nevertheless have a certain churning of the foreign and defense policy machinery with the appointment of a new Secretary of State and the pending appointment of a new Secretary of Defense. So with that, I will turn over to Dana. Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much. I should note that for those who didn't catch the reference, that forward with question mark was an allusion to the Obama campaign slogan, which was forward without the question mark, obviously, and some people thought it was a fairly a lame slogan, but anyway, they had to come up with what they could. The reason that I'm going to focus on domestic issues and let Mark handle foreign policy, although I also hope to enter into the foreign policy discussion in the Q&A, is first because I'm very interested in it, but secondly because it's sort of one of my epistemological assertions that you cannot really understand the United States as a global superpower without understanding what it's going through internally, and it's going through a lot internally. And I think it's important from a sort of American studies point of view not to treat it as a black box and creating a certain foreign policy posture or sustainability for that matter. A second sort of prefatory remark I would make concerns how we tend to evaluate the significance of contemporary events. And the point being that, there's a natural, and I'm talking, when I say we, I'm talking in particular about people who pontificate on foreign policy or strategic issues, and we may tend to exaggerate and over-extrapolate those events, and of course we're subject to cognitive bias. Mitt Romney and his campaign advisors and most of the Republican ecosphere, so to speak, were genuinely believed on election day that they were riding a wave to victory. And they were shocked when it wasn't even that close. And of course, my point being that there's a risk of over-interpreting what you see and what you observe the other way. Particularly when it comes to a question that I want to raise at the outset, which is whether this election is an indication of what we might call a liberal realignment in American politics. The Democratic candidate for president has won the popular vote in 5 of 6 of the last national elections, taking us back more than a generation, if you consider a generation to be 20 years. Moreover, it's probably significant that Obama has now twice won an actual majority of the popular vote. You'll recall that Clinton and Gore faced significant third-party opponents. In Clinton's case, a third party that might be seen as center-right, although in Gore's case it was obviously on the left. Anyway, he's twice won the popular vote, and the last time a Democrat won the popular vote was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Sorry, won a majority, a full majority. If this is a realignment, it would be a realignment, broadly speaking, the third in a century. It's pretty clear that there was a center-left consensus that underpinned the Democratic ascendancy from Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932 until the end of the Johnson presidency in 1968. That was a 30-year span. It saw the triumph of an American New Deal version of the kind of communitarian creeds that emerged in Europe around the same period. Catholic Christian democracy and secular social democracy on the continent, Labour Party socialism in Britain. The next, if we count 3 realignments, the next one was the Nixon-Reagan conservative realignment, which I think was a peculiarly American phenomena because it drew strength from some particular American issues. The civil rights movement, a reaction to the civil rights movement in the South, I should say, very serious urban crime in the United States. But of course, it was also part of a broader shift to the right among most Western democracies at a time when cheap oil was no longer available, and what you might call the neo-Keynesian welfare states in Europe and the United States had run into some common difficulties, including a tendency towards inflation. But what about, so, you know, even though the Reagan administration failed in its supposed goal of reducing the size of, it manifestly failed to reduce the size of government, it did have a real intellectual and political impact in moving the center of political discussion and political gravity to the right on a lot of these issues. So the question is whether these 5 Democratic popular vote victories represent a movement back in the direction of the left. In 2002, John Judas and Roy Texiera, I'm not sure I pronounce his name right, but Judas is a liberal historian, journalist, and Texiera is a political scientist, published a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority. This was a little bit over 10 years ago. And it was consciously, the title was an explicit reference to a book written by Kevin Phillips, published in, I think, 1969, called The Emerging Republican Majority. And in the Judas Texiera, in the Democratic version, they argued that, quote, a longer trend is leading American politics from the conservative Republican majority of the 1980s to a new Democratic majority. Democrats aren't there yet. They had to say that because, of course, I think it came out right after the 2002 elections in which, George W. Bush had significantly consolidated a Republican congressional majority. Anyway, Democrats aren't there yet, but barring the unforeseen, they should arrive by the decade's end. Now, as I say, they were writing in the face of current events, but like Phillips in 1968, they pointed to what they regarded as very significant socio-political trends favoring their argument. The black vote was going to remain a certainty for the Democrats. The growing Hispanic population despite the fact that Karl Rove had set his sights on Hispanics because he thought they were naturally, he believed they had a kind of Catholic affinity with conservatism, but in fact they were trending the other way. And they were trending the other way even before the problem arose of sort of a harsh anti-immigrant attitudes that animated the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party, because polling indicates that Hispanics are disposed to favor an active state with a remit for at least modest redistribution of wealth. A significant stratum of well-educated whites, which had been the traditional source of moderate republicanism, were becoming more liberal. And the argument was that this would easily compensate for some democratic losses among the white working class. Women were voting in greater numbers for Democrats. And it was seen as highly significant, and I think this has been borne out in subsequent elections, that the youth vote was turning more liberal. Not because the young stay forever young, but because voting habits once established tend to stay more or less fixed. So anyway, Obama won decisively in 2008, but you could interpret this as a singular event. Obviously, there was deep disaffection with the George W. Bush administration. We had the financial crisis, and it was a moment of great excitement with a kind of charismatic figure having the promise of overcoming America's long-standing racial divide. The question, to repeat, is whether his win in 2012 may indicate something more lasting. Now, obviously, you need to be, as I said at the outset, one has to be careful about making sweeping predictions. And it is absolutely the case that although Obama won a decisive and to some people surprisingly large victory and a very large electoral college victory, Mitt Romney got about 1 out of every 2 votes. But the point I'm making, and I will leave it here in terms of the analysis, but we can come back to it in discussion, is that the ingredients of Obama's latest victory were precisely those that Judas and Teixeira had predicted would lead to a realignment by the end of the first decade of this century. Now, Obama, since re-election, has in certain ways behaved as though he thinks he has a kind of liberal realignment mandate. He's faced down the House Republicans and won on the issue of raising marginal tax rates for individuals earning more than $400,000 a year. I mean, he insisted that he was going to set the threshold at $250,000 a year, but as a matter of principle, at least he won this victory. Now, this is in practical terms fairly moderate. We are not going back to even Clinton-era tax rates, much less the very high marginal tax rates of the Obama administration. But in his inaugural address, Obama kind of made clear that he's not finished. He spoke and it was a robustly liberal speech. He made clear, it spoke in very ringing terms about equality, including gay rights, which I think is probably the first time that gay rights has been specifically referenced or specifically proclaimed as a goal in a presidential inaugural speech. He talked about economic equality and and defended a significant role for government. In fact, he used the phrase collective action, which was almost surely meant as an intentional tweak to all his critics who had accused him of being a communist. I mean, he could have said national action, community action. I mean, there are many, many good euphemisms for but he decided to use the word collective action and let see what kind of reaction it could provoke. I think he did that intentionally. He had a whole paragraph, I think it was a whole paragraph, I meant to re-look at it this morning, but on the issue of climate change, which I'm going to come back to at the end of my talk, at the end of my presentation, which will be in 4 minutes. And he did not mention the budget deficit, except obliquely in saying that we need to reduce or get control of healthcare costs. Now, let me say I think this was appropriate, not mentioning the budget deficit. The deficit and the debt have gotten too much attention as a kind of creating the idea of an immediate emergency at the expense of real emergencies, a current one involving joblessness and an impending threat that is potentially catastrophic and certainly irreversible over the course of the centuries, climate change. The fiscal situation and the fiscal debate in the United States was a big campaign theme, but the argument I would maintain was not really over deficits and debt. I say this for two reasons. First of all, because the deficit problem is on its way to being solved, and it could be solved. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities has published a report a few weeks ago, at the beginning of this month, basically making the case that we are halfway, the spending cuts and tax increases that were part of the two deals we've had so far between Obama and House Republicans have brought us halfway to the point of stabilizing our deficit problem, our debt problem. That is to say, if we, it's amounted to, I think, between $1.5 and $2 trillion in savings already. And if you added, according to their calculations, another $1.4 trillion in savings, which certainly should be doable, you would stabilize the debt and really stabilize it for the medium term at roughly, I think, 73, 74% of GDP, which is, you know, once you're in a situation where the debt is no longer growing faster than the economy, you're in a perfectly respectable situation. There is, as I think Obama acknowledged in his inaugural address, there is a longer-term problem involving healthcare costs, but I'll talk about that in a minute. I mean, the second reason why I say the fiscal situation was not a big campaign theme is that it's pretty clear that the deficit per se is not what's being debated. I'm referring here to both the stated intent but also the behavior of the Republican opposition, because they haven't approached the problem of the deficit in sort of dictionary terms as the difference between spending and revenue. Rather, they have very explicitly said that the problem is spending and the size of the government, which is a perfectly respectable position. And in fact, this was a big election in which this was really the large philosophical issue that was being debated, and sometimes very seriously debated. Romney was famously seen and heard on a secret videotape saying that a big part of the problem was that 40% of voters were out of reach to his arguments, 47% of voters, I should say, because they are dependent on government and see themselves as victims. Now, I think he was pretty clearly expressing a genuine conviction and one that's held by a very large minority, I'd say, of Americans, and certainly the American political class. If you think this was an unfair catch because he was being secretly recorded, you can look at the Republican nominating convention, where speaker after speaker, including Romney, used some version of the line, "We did build that," or "I did build that." This was attacking Obama's slightly mangled version of a talk that Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren gave, which when she was at the early part of her campaign, which went viral on YouTube. And for those of you who didn't hear it, I think it's worth repeating what she said. This was actually, I think, a riff in response to a question, and this is what she said. "There is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you. But I want to be clear, you moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory. Now look, you built a factory and turned it into something terrific or a great idea. God bless. Keep a big hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is that you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes along." As I say, Obama tried a version of this on the campaign trail, but he kind of mangled it, and it was easy for it to be taken out of context. But, you know, I think the dispute and the attack on what Obama said is why I think this was a really truly serious campaign. Because the very, you know, in a way that I can't recall in a recent election, the very purpose of American state and society was put on the ballot. And I think it was put there reasonably well by both sides. I don't know if Romney's 47% figure is accurate, but if you add up all balance up all forms of taxes and benefits, I think it sounds plausible. Just to take one important example, the earned income tax credit, which is a kind of negative income tax for employed people whose income is below a certain level. This was originally seen as a conservative idea to reform the welfare state that would, in order to encourage work, as opposed to traditional welfare payments for, as it was seen, doing nothing. Another way of looking at it is that at a time when free market mechanisms are driving huge income inequalities, the earned income tax credit is one way of subsidizing low-income work that has to be done by someone. It is a way of redistributing and evening out, to a very modest extent, market results. What we saw in this campaign is that Obama thinks that is a good idea, and his opponents generally did not. So when we look at the fiscal fights with looming deadlines, you know, the fiscal ceiling standoff in summer 2011, the fiscal cliff standoff that we just got through, the upcoming fights over sequestration, and possibly another fight over the debt ceiling, I think it's important to separate issues of overall affordability from questions of distribution, because these are two things that are both being debated, but they're sometimes mixed up. And because I'm out of time, I'll leave out the question of the example I wanted to go into, which is the very important example of healthcare. I was also going to conclude very briefly to say something about Obama's agenda, mainly to point out the difficulty of it being achieved, because you still have a very divided government. I think maybe I'll save that for the Q&A. The main point I would make, the last point I was going to put on here, which again I said was the most important, involves climate change. And it, as I say, it contained a full paragraph in his inaugural address. Senator John Kerry, who I guess is Secretary of State John Kerry starting tomorrow, has been a strong advocate of climate action in the Senate. Nothing is going to happen in terms of legislation. I would say it's pretty much impossible. And what Obama's administration has said is that they're going to look to do things in terms of regulation, that there are vast regulatory powers that the administration has, and that the Supreme Court upheld by saying that the Environmental Protection Agency could regulate greenhouse gases as pollution. Now, the open question is, of course, why would you do this? What good would it do, given that obviously the United States cannot solve the climate change problem on its own if it's not part of a global agreement? And the argument, which I think the administration is going to push, is, you know, there's a soft power argument, obviously, about the United States being in the lead, but there's, I think, even a more concrete argument, which is that if the United States by 2020, through things that the President of the United States actually can do, comes close to meeting its, in its case, its non-binding Kyoto target, since it didn't ratify Kyoto, it would put itself in a good position to be in the forefront in a leadership role on the kind of technology that would make possible a global agreement that really would be serious. And it might be in the position to do that because of the gas shale revolution, because there's been actually fairly considerable advances in the United States in terms of energy efficiency. And we've also, of course, been helped by the recession. I did go on a bit long, but...
Okay, plenty to come back to, but Mark, foreign policy.
Thanks. I know I was told in advance that the division of labor was that Dana does domestic policy and I do foreign policy, but I'm not sure I fully digested that. So for those of you who don't share my infatuation with matters nuclear. I hope you'll forgive me that I approach the foreign policy topic through the lens of my non-proliferation and disarmament portfolio and structured my remarks accordingly. So I'm leaving out in my structured prepared remarks commentary about such important issues as Syria and China and EU and so forth, but I don't mind talking about that in discussion. What I'm very interested in is whether in this next term Obama will be able to fulfill more of the promise that he laid out in his famous Prague speech in April 2009 about reducing nuclear dangers. He had some initial successes after that speech, particularly the New START agreement that reduced the limit for offensively deployed nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia. But it stalled, the agenda stalled after that, not because of any lack of will on Obama's part, but because of the seemingly insurmountable obstacles. You had Republican senators blocking any ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. You had Pakistan blocking any discussion of a fissile material cutoff treaty. Putin apparently intent on blocking any progress on missile defense agreements or further arms control. Israel blocking any discussion of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. Countries like Brazil blocking expansion of IAEA safeguards by adopting the additional protocol, and so forth. Now, as you know, foreign policy played very little role in the US presidential campaign. It was hardly mentioned except in one debate that was supposed to be devoted to foreign policy, and even that one shifted to US educational policy. There were no foreign policy initiatives that any candidate enunciated. So based on that, I predicted in my survival article that Obama's second term would be largely reactive rather than proactive in the foreign policy arena. And I didn't mean that in a pejorative sense. I didn't mean it to be critical, because, look, managing the crises that are created by other people is far better than creating crises for other people. And I take it you all get my point. And then I think my prediction kind of came true, because in Obama's second inaugural address, there was hardly any mention of foreign policy except the climate change mitigation that Dana referred to. And I was kind of, sorry, I'm not bragging, but in my survival article, I did say I thought climate change mitigation might be the one theme that Obama might pick up to pursue. Where I was wrong in my survival article, maybe, is that I didn't predict that the Obama administration would move smartly on the Prague agenda. And you know, yesterday, or maybe it was today, I saw in the Josh Rogan cable blog that we all are obliged to read first thing in the morning, that Vice President Joe Biden is off to Munich to talk to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and National Security Advisor Tom Donilon is going to Moscow early next month, February, to prepare for new nuclear discussions. Donilon reportedly will be carrying a letter from Obama articulating ideas for further arms reduction. Now, clearly, Obama is personally driving this arms reduction policy. He sees it as a key part of his legacy. He wants new talks to be broader than the New START agreement, which, as I say, capped only the offensively deployed nuclear weapons. The next round should also include strategic non-deployed weapons and non-strategic weapons. In other words, a comprehensive cap on all nuclear weapons. And then you've got to throw missile defense into there, because that's what Russia is going to require to have any limits on arms. I don't think a comprehensive agreement is going to be possible in 4 years. I hope he tries. I think even if a comprehensive agreement isn't possible, some elements of that might be possible. I mean, for starters, maybe an agreement on transparency and verification of non-strategic nuclear weapons. you know, the 200 that the United States has deployed in Europe, and the 2,000 or maybe 1,000. According to a Russian expert at RUSI, it's only 1,000 Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Nobody knows because there's no transparency. Maybe there could be an agreement on missile defense cooperation, something that the United States and Russia had been working on rather intently up until a couple of years ago, when Russia imposed an impossible condition, said that they wanted the United States to provide a legal guarantee that U.S. Missile defenses in Europe would not be poised to protect against Russian, would not be deployed against Russian strategic weapons. And it's just an impossible condition. Obama can't do that without being, you know, eaten alive by the Congress. And I'm not even sure he can do it constitutionally, prohibiting a future president from changing it. So if there's going to be progress, Russia's going to have to drop that condition. And I think conceivably they could. With regard to nuclear arms numbers, I've been awaiting a Department of Defense study that should provide justification for reducing offensively deployed weapons significantly below the ceiling of New START, which was 1,550. There's been a lot of commentary that it could be reduced to 1,000, or even fewer maybe. And that study was supposed to have come out last year. It was delayed apparently until after the election to provide some freedom of movement. So now the election's safely over, I think we might see that. And then the pending budget cuts in the Pentagon, you know, not just the fiscal cliff of sequestration, but any financial deal is going to impose serious cuts to the Pentagon's budget. And if you talk to any, almost any general or defense, well, mostly generals, they would say, cut the nuclear weapons first. They can't use them. They, you know, they're just something you have to maintain, and that should contribute to a reduction. But Obama doesn't want to reduce unilaterally because the political baggage that would entail. And I think that's why Tom Donilon is going to Moscow, to try to get something in play, because the United States wants to cut anyway. Russia should want to cut. They face budget difficulties too, and I think there is a prospect there. On another of the Prague promises, I really wish that there could be an initiative these 4 years to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That's the step that would most signal to the world that the United States was serious about eventual disarmament. Because if you can't test anymore, eventually you won't be producing, you know, new kinds of nuclear weapons, and you'll run down your arsenal eventually. Is it possible? I was negative. I was pessimistic in my survival article. But then I saw Steven Spielberg's movie, Lincoln. And that's a powerful story of how an astute, committed president, using all the resources that he has at his disposal, can make things happen. Now, okay, I'm a little bit fanatical about nuclear weapons. I know that, you know, I shouldn't liken CTBT ratification to the 13th Amendment. That would be a stretch. But like slavery, nuclear weapons should be abolished. The technical arguments in favor of CTBT ratification are beyond dispute. The advances in stockpile stewardship make retesting of U.S. weapons unnecessary for decades and decades to come. Advances in the technology for seismic monitoring put to rest any arguments that the CTBT would allow cheating. When North Korea tests its third nuclear device, and I say when, not if, and it's probably going to be in the next few days, you can bet the farm that the CTBT seismic monitoring stations are going to pick it up. But finding 12 Republican senators who will listen to the technical arguments and ratify the CTBT to provide the 67 votes necessary is going to be very difficult. And Obama would have to determine whether this is where he wants to spend his political capital. And I don't know that opponents can be bought off as easily or with the kind of tactics that Lincoln used to buy off some of those who opposed the 13th Amendment. And it was very last month when the U.S. Senate could not ratify, couldn't muster the votes to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Even though that UN convention would simply require the rest of the world to adopt the same standards that Americans already enjoy through domestic legislation, and even though former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, former Republican Party candidate for president, was out there leading the fight in support of this.
In a wheelchair.
In a wheelchair, they couldn't get, they fell 5 votes short of the 67. And of the 8 Republicans who voted for it, 4 of them aren't there anymore. And you don't have anybody like Bob Dole on the Republican side promoting the CTBT because Senator Richard Lugar is out of office. But look, let's not be discouraged. I look forward to a Son of Spielberg production about Obama, which in the second half tells the story of how Barack overcame these impossible odds. Now, getting to the theme of my survival article, which was that Iran will determine Obama's legacy. I said that because it's with Iran that, in the words attributed to Harold Macmillan, that it's events, dear boys, events, that are most likely to blow the Obama administration off course. In the 3rd election debate with Romney, Obama vowed that as long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will not get nuclear weapons. He also said, we're not going to allow Iran to perpetually engage in negotiations that lead nowhere. We have a sense of when they would get breakout capability, which means that we would not be able to intervene in time to stop their nuclear program, and that clock is ticking. Now, since Obama said these words on October 22nd, the clock has continued ticking, and it's going to be ticking faster very soon. Newswires this morning reported that Iran told the IAEA it would be installing in the large centrifuge facility at Natanz more advanced centrifuges, the 2nd-generation model they've been working on for 10 years, which produce enriched uranium 4 to 5 times faster. If they introduce 3,000 or more centrifuges, that, as was reported by AP, that'll be a game changer. That'll significantly shorten the timeline for having the capability to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons if Iran were to take that step. So that's the report that awaits John Kerry his first day at Foggy Bottom, plus the North Korea testing. That'll probably be the 2nd day. Now, meanwhile, diplomacy with Iran just stalled. It's stalled. They can't even come to the table. Iran pretends that it's the venue that's the big issue. You know, whether it be Cairo, Kazakhstan, it's not the venue. They're just not ready for talks. Whether it was before the election, people said, well, you got to wait until after Iran knows who's going to be in the White House for the next 4 years. And I predicted in my survival article that, okay, then there would be maybe talks would get started. But it's been 3 months now almost since the election. Iran just doesn't want to engage. They don't know what to say in response to the package. They just want to keep their, I'm sorry to say, I think they just want to keep the nuclear program going until they get to a point where they don't have to make a decision on accepting any limits. So some commentators have said that one reason that Iran doesn't want to set a date and a place for talks is they're waiting to see who's going to be occupying the Secretary's office in the Pentagon. Now it's pretty clearly, I think, going to be Chuck Hagel. And in any case, but it doesn't really matter that much in terms of the negotiations, because that's John Kerry's job, and ultimately Barack Obama's. And Obama is, I think, going to be the action officer on the Iran account. But Hagel's selection will make a big difference in, if it comes to, when push comes to shove, in the formulation and employment of other options on the table. Because, as you all know, like Obama, Chuck Hagel will not choose military force except as a last option. I believe that that last option may well come during Obama's second term. As I wrote in Survival, unless Iran accepts significant limits at some point in Obama's next 4 years, its enriched uranium stockpile and enrichment capability will grow too large for Israeli and American comfort. And even if Iran does not purposely cross Obama's red line of weapons acquisition, the size of a growing enriched uranium stockpile and the ability to enrich it to weapons grade at short notice will at some point render invisible the line between capability and production. That's the worry that Obama expressed in the third presidential debate about Iran reaching a point where the United States would not be able to intervene in time to stop their nuclear program. And I fear Iran's program is on a trajectory to do that in the next 4 years. That's why I say the Iran issue is going to determine Obama's foreign policy legacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Very, very sobering. We now have some time for Q&A. One of the peculiarities of this particular meeting space is that we don't have handheld microphones. So what that means is I'm going to have to act as ventriloquist because this is being taped for streaming on our website. So it's to your advantage then if in making your intervention or asking your question you keep it reasonably brief so that I can adequately summarize all of the nuance, penetrating insight and everything else that you might have to offer. Gentleman here in the front row caught my eye first.
Tom Fenton, retired American journalist. Are some commentators reading too much into prospect of America reaching sufficiency or energy sufficiency or near sufficiency in the future and the impact that will have on its Middle East involvement?
Is the question of America reaching energy sufficiency exaggerated in terms of its foreign policy implications? Who wants to tackle that?
I think it's a very important development. It's an amazing development that the United States will no longer be dependent for domestic purposes on the Middle East. But the United States will maintain the role of, like it or not, the world policeman. It will maintain the role of protecting the stability and security of the Middle East for its allies in Europe and elsewhere. And it will have a little more freedom of action, but I don't think it will fundamentally change America's determination to be the player the indispensable player in the Middle East.
Just very briefly, I mean, there's a large question about, in a global energy market, whether it makes sense to talk about self-sufficiency. I mean, there is a, you know the argument, there's a price for energy. You know, the fact that China might have more concern in these terms about reliability of supply from the United States, from the Middle East than the United States does seem intuitively, despite what I just said, to be important. I mean, America's, commitments in the Middle East in regard to what Mark finished on, which is non-proliferation and Iran, our relationship with Israel, which is obviously a troubled one and was going to continue to be a troubled one, I think, but is nonetheless going to still keep us very much engaged and committed to the Middle East. These things aren't going to change. Another interesting question, sorry to go back to my repeated theme, is what the new prospects of new technology, shale gas, does for an effort to deal with climate change issues. And our resident expert, who is not here in the room right now, is Jeff Mazo. But since I knew I was going to be talking about this, I interrogated him before this meeting. And his view was that, yes, if dealing with coal-fired plants in the United States is low-hanging fruit, and shale gas would help in that regard. But it depends on, it's not perfect, obviously, but it depends on what it displaces. I mean, if it displaces coal, then we're doing well. If it displaces future greener technology, then we're not doing very well.
Yes, please.
My name is Mahmoud Ali, member of the Institute. Assuming that Chuck Hagel gets to the Pentagon following the hearing today, how will Tim Obama, Kerry, Hagel treat China differently, particularly with regard to what you call a pivot or a balanced utilization.
And what does the appointment of Chuck Hagel as Defense Secretary and John Kerry as Secretary of State presage for the efficiency with which the US manages the touted pivot to Asia?
That's a very difficult question, which I think Mark should answer.
In my career in government and at the Institute, I've observed Asia policy to be one of the areas where U.S. policy doesn't change significantly from administration to administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican. And I don't think it would change depending on who's the Secretary of Defense. China's role is going to weigh very heavily in U.S. policy, and they will continue the policy of constructive engagement and seeking to intertwine China in an entangling web of interactions with the world system, so they won't be a revolutionary power, they'll be a status quo power. How to manage China's expansionary desires is going to be the trick. And it's, there are some worrisome developments. The Chinese behavior toward Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands is going to take some careful management. And I think Hagel will be, managing that from the Pentagon's perspective in a way that tries to keep things from erupting.
Just one thing, I think that Hagel is one of the most significant things about Hagel as Secretary of Defense is that he, assuming he's confirmed, he comes into office believing that the Pentagon budget is bloated. Whether he maintains that position when he's in charge of it is another question. But he's, of all the possible picks, I think he's one who really would go at cutting the Pentagon defense spending not with great reluctance, but with a certain amount of gusto.
Yes, please. I think the question is about whether the American retrenchment from theaters in Afghanistan and Iraq lessens the military option that is available to it in dealing with some of the worst case scenarios with respect to military action against Iran that Mark referenced in his presentation.
I don't mean to say this with any enthusiasm for military options, but I think the retrenchment actually increases America's flexibility of options. Not having as many troops in theaters where Iran can cause trouble for them gives the United States, I think, a little bit more flexibility. In any case, any action vis-a-vis Iran would not be conducted from U.S. ground forces based in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's going to be air power if it happens, naval assets. The one thing that might make a difference is, and I'm not too much of an expert on this, you probably want some special forces to help guide bombs in, and it maybe makes it slightly more difficult, but I hesitate to go too far down that line.
That's right.
Alex Nichol?
Mark referred to Lincoln using all the means available to get things done. And led me to think that perhaps one of the things you said about Obama is that he hasn't been very good at doing that in his first term. And you might disagree with that, but you could say that he hasn't actually been a very good politician in some ways and dealing with Congress in particular. And I wonder, on the other hand, there's a very intransigent position. So the question is whether the conditions change in the second term on both sides, whether he, should be better at this, or actually whether the Republicans might be more amenable to dealing with it.
Thanks. The question is, given that Obama, according to the questioner, has not been good at demonstrating Lincolnian skills of political management. Is that trend likely to correct itself in the second administration, and will there be a receptive audience among Republicans for new lines of approach?
Yeah, I think you probably should deconstruct this question a little bit. I mean, there is a common accusation that Obama is too aloof, too cool. He doesn't like schmoozing enough with, the comparison that's usually made is not to Lincoln, which is, in this case, is an artifact of this movie, really, but to LBJ, who obviously spent many, many years in the Senate, in the House and then the Senate, was a masterful political manipulator, and got huge legislation, including the Civil Rights Act, through Congress. Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is I think the situation that Obama faces is genuinely different. Insofar as, I mean, part of it is structural, you know, and I've said this on this stage or the stage in Arundel House before, but it's worth repeating. In the 1960s and in the late 1950s, when Lyndon Johnson was Senate Majority Leader and got his first civil rights bill through, you had a very complicated, broken up political structure in the United States. Owing to the fact that the South, the segregationist South, was pretty much solidly Democratic. And so the parties were not ideologically homogenous. They were very much ideologically crisscrossing. There were liberal, moderate, and even very liberal Republicans in the Northeast and the Midwest who were in favor of civil rights legislation. And this was a sort of very variegated political terrain on which Lyndon Johnson could work. Obama has nothing like that, nothing like that. The polarization is documented in terms of the fact that the most leftward Republican is to the right in terms of his voting record. I mean, it depends on how you define left and right, obviously, but you know, political scientists have done this. Is to the right, is further right than the most right one was to the left, or whatever. I think you know what I'm trying to say. It's not quite the same thing on the Democratic side. There are conservative Democrats, particularly in the Senate, but of course that only makes Obama's task more difficult on issues such as climate change. Now, the question is, one of the problems is that, at least in terms of the narrative, is Obama came in based on a mythology of being a great conciliator. You know, he had done this, he had dealt well when he was president, editor of the Harvard Law Review, and dealing with very conservative contributors. He gave his famous speech that burst him on the national stage in 2004, was denying the salience of the red and blue divisions in the United States. He's of mixed race. And I think he genuinely saw himself as a transformational figure in this regard. And this has been his great failure. I mean, I think it's a failure of exaggerated expectations rather than anything he did, but it is a great failure. What has he done since then, since re-election? He's been more effective in some ways. I think he was very effective in the first term, by the way. I mean, he got a lot through, including his health care legislation. But you know, there were certain things he could not get over through negotiation and schmoozing. He's tried to play hardball, and he's had some success already. He got the Republicans to fold when we were coming up against this so-called fiscal cliff at the end of the year. He was able to get increased tax rates on incomes over $400,000 through Congress, and he did this. I mean, it was hard to see how this was going to work, but it happened because the so-called Hastert Room rule was abandoned, and somehow, the Speaker Boehner, in charge of the Republican House, allowed a vote to happen in the House with a majority to be passed by a majority of the members rather than a majority of his caucus. I mean, that was the rule. He wouldn't bring anything to the floor unless he had the support of a majority of the Republicans. But he saw that this was going to lead to a disaster, and so he let the bill through. Then Obama said, I am not going to negotiate again on the debt ceiling. And it was sort of hard to see what he meant by this, because, how could he not negotiate on the debt ceiling? The answer when journalists asked people in his administration said, if the subject comes up, we're not going to discuss it. We're not going to return anybody's phone calls. We're not going to answer any emails. We are simply not going to discuss the debt ceiling. It is up to Congress to authorize the increase of the debt ceiling for spending that they've already appropriated. And people scratched their head and said, how's he going to get away with this? Well, lo and behold, it was a very hard line, and it almost seemed like a bluff. But lo and behold, the Republicans have realized they were in an untenable position, that if there was a default on the debt, which would have been potentially catastrophic to the economy, they were going to be blamed. So that seemed to work, and they've decided. I mean, it hasn't been completely put off, but it's been put off till May, in a way that sort of suggests that they get the idea. They're not going to want to continue, since these votes are difficult for them. They're not going to continue, now that they've admitted that they don't want to face the political consequences of letting the United States default. It's hard to imagine that they're going to want to have a lot more of these votes. So the presumption is that they're going to figure out a way to solve this problem permanently. So what I'm saying is, playing hardball, being a good sort of negotiator and schmoozer has not really worked for him. So far, playing hardball seems to be doing better for him.
Thank you. Edward Chaplin, try to get into just a couple more questions before we run out of time, please.
Thanks very much, Edward Chaplin, former diplomat with some experience of post-revolution in Iran. It's Iran I wanted to ask about. I'm sure Mark's right, it's going to be a defining issue for the Obama administration. But actually, one comment. I think the Iranian failure to engage has as much to do with domestic Iranian factors as it does with anything else. It's not that they want to push on nuclear programs because they don't want to have any deal with Obama, the president. So post-June elections is all like a window of opportunity, I think. But the wider question I wanted to ask was, surely most people recognize, I hope, that the problem with Iran goes much wider than nuclear. And there's been a failure for 30 plus years of the resistance to Islamic revolution for the US and Iran to work out any practical working relationship. And that's very bad news for everybody who has anything at stake in the Middle East. And I just wonder the extent, and I recognize that there's a difficulties with what I'm asking, but the extent to which Obama may have in his mind to get beyond the nuclear issue to a wider engagement with Iran. Because most of the problems, that you might say, are crucial for the US in the Middle East, despite its participation and so on. Cannot be solved without having Iran at least neutral, if not constructively engaged. And that's a long-term prospect, but you have to start somewhere. I guess what I'm asking is what's the prospect for a sort of Nixon in China moment with Iran?
Thanks very much. Edward Chaplin observed that the Iranian failure to engage in serious negotiations or negotiations of any kind was driven as much by domestic political considerations as anything else, and then posed the question as to whether the Obama administration might be moving towards transcending a near exclusive preoccupation with the nuclear issue in its dealings with Iran in order to move towards a more broad-based set of discussions which, if Iranian cooperation could be obtained through, would aid American objectives more broadly in the Middle East.
Thank you. And I should start off saying I agree with your opening observation that domestic politics have much to do with Iran's current inability to come to the table. I didn't expect that things would get stalled so quickly because of the June date. But your point is a good one, that people don't want Ahmadinejad to be the one who gets credit if there is a breakthrough, So we won't have any prospect until August, when the new president comes to power, and then he takes some time to get things together. So how to get between now and September is probably going to be tricky. I fully agree too with the point that the relations with Iran are deeper in, well, let me say, put it this way, more broader than the nuclear issue. But I think it's the nuclear issue that impinges on America's strongest sense of national security dangers. If it weren't for Iran's nuclear program, the United States wouldn't feel its vital national interests were threatened, or and that Israel's security interests were threatened. Now, there'd still be issues of stability in the Middle East and so forth, all of which are very important, but I don't think they quite reach the level, and that's why the emphasis on the nuclear program, and I expect that that will continue. Would the United States be willing to widen the agenda? Absolutely, they would be willing. I think there's no preventing that, but the question would be, would they seek to widen it in ways that would put the nuclear issue secondary? And I don't foresee that happening because of the dominant threat that is felt by the security program and by the nuclear program.
Thank you. Two more questions. You, sir, in the front.
What could be a careful management on Senkaku? British media sometimes said that Japan and China are to go to war on Senkaku, even China and the US go to.
Mark, do you have a peace plan for the Senkaku dispute?
The United States and I'm sure all of the United States Western allies and partners are concerned about the Senkaku dispute escalating in ways that would bring about an exchange of hostile fire. And I place the onus of this on China, but Japan will also have a responsibility to keep things from escalating. I think any solution to the Senkaku dispute, in my own view, would ideally involve a mediation by the International Court of Justice. Now, this would require Japan to acknowledge that there is a dispute, which it doesn't acknowledge today, and that would be a big concession on Japan's part. But I think if the issue were brought to the International Court of Justice, Japan would win the case. As I see it, Japan's got a stronger historical case. Now, some say if Japan took that step, this would have repercussions for its position with regard to other disputed territories, the Tokto Takeshima issue or the Northern Islands. But I think, in the case of the Tokto Island, it's Japan that would like the issue to go to the International Court of Justice. So if you set a precedent on Senkakus, it might be helpful. Similarly with the Northern Territories.
Then you, sir, in the second row.
You say that China is more than possible. Non-proliferation is a very important issue for the President. Which direction do you see the NPT going, the conference 2 years from now? And is that in fact the most important achievement for launching the goal of non-proliferation?
What can we expect for the NPT in the next 2 years in respect of US policy?
The NPT will remain the cornerstone of the global non-proliferation regime. It won't fall apart despite the threats to it. But the consensus that undermines the NPT is fraying. And in the next couple of years, it will fray further if there's not some way that this issue of a WMD free zone in the Middle East can be at least discussed. You know, the failure to hold a conference last year was entirely understandable, and there's not going to be a Middle East nuclear weapons free zone anytime that I can see, but you at least have to take it seriously, take the aspirations of the Arab world seriously, and talk about it, hold a conference to talk about it. And if you don't do that, the next NPT review conference, 2005, will be very difficult to manage. So the United States will be trying its best to manage that, but it's going to need to get some cooperation from some of its important partners. And I think the NPT probably will remain the most important tool in the non-proliferation toolbox, but the United States will continue to look for other tools that are of a more ad hoc nature, like the Proliferation Security Initiative, coalition of the willing arrangements of people to take what steps they can to reduce nuclear dangers. I think they will be looking across the range of tools and instruments.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'd like to draw your attention to two events next week at which this discussion, or elements of it at least, will be carried forward. On Wednesday, the 6th of February, at Arundel House, in what is going to be, by then, a wholly refurbished fifth-floor meeting space with much more amenity and space available to it. We will have a discussion about North Korea that will be led by Joel Witt, who's a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, D.C. And on the same day, at 12:30, one of our latest staff appointments at the ISS, Dr. Samuel Charap, who is our new senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia, based in our Washington, D.C. office, will be at Arundel House in order to discuss US-Russia relations in Obama's second term, with a particular accent placed on what the implications are for Europe. But in the meantime, thank you all for trekking here to Bloomsbury House and for your questions, and I hope to see you at Arundel House next week. Thank you.